For more than a century, this photograph rested in an archive at the University of Alabama, catalogued simply as Three Sisters, Montgomery County. Around 1898, historians had glanced at it, stored it carefully, and later digitized it. Hardly anyone gave it much thought. It seemed ordinary, just another portrait of a family trying to survive the harsh realities of the Jim Crow South. Nothing about it appeared mysterious. Nothing suggested the impossible until Dr. Patricia Hayes zoomed in. Dr. Patricia Hayes zoomed in. Hayes, a medical historian at Vanderbilt University, had spent 3 years digitizing photographs of black families from the post-Reconstruction era. She had processed thousands of images, documenting faces, clothing, and locations. Most of the work was routine and repetitive. Then one afternoon in March 2023, she opened the file containing the Three Sisters. She began her normal inspection, checking the image clarity, adjusting the resolution, and then she noticed something in the youngest sister's arms that made her breath stop for a moment. The musculature looked wrong. Not just strong, but unbelievably dense for a 16-year-old girl living in poverty. In 1898, the muscle definition visible, even through the cloth of her dress, belonged on a laborer twice her age. Dr. Hayes leaned closer to her screen, her heart beating faster. She had seen something like this before, but only in modern medical journals describing one of the rarest genetic conditions known to science, a condition that would not be identified for another 99 years. If you're fascinated by hidden mysteries and old photographs, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. What we are about to uncover may change how you look at history forever. The photograph was catalogued as Item 4127 in the University of Alabama's Reconstruction Era Archive. When Dr. Hayes first opened the digital file, she followed her standard process, checking the metadata, confirming the date and location, and examining the image for any damage or fading that might affect preservation. Montgomery County, Alabama, 1898. 3 subjects, female, estimated ages 16 to 18. Rural setting, probably sharecroppers or domestic workers. She made her initial notes and zoomed in to verify the image quality. That was when she saw it. The youngest sister's forearms, partly visible beneath the 3/4 sleeves of her dress, showed muscle definition that should not have existed. Not on a teenage girl, not in 1898, not living in the exhausting poverty of the post-slavery South, where chronic malnutrition was common. The muscle lines were visible even in the grainy photograph, the density unmistakable. Her shoulders were broader than her sister's, her neck thicker, her entire upper body suggesting a level of physical development that did not fit the environment. Dr. Hayes had spent 15 years studying historical health conditions, examining thousands of photographs from this era. She knew what malnourished bodies looked like, what years of manual labor created, what poverty carved into flesh and bone. This was different. This was unusual in a way that made her hands shake slightly as she adjusted the zoom again. She had seen this type of musculature before, but only in modern medical journals, only in case studies describing a genetic condition so rare that fewer than 100 cases had been documented worldwide, a condition that science did not even identify until 1997, 99 years after this photograph had been taken. Dr. Hayes leaned back from her computer, her mind racing through the impossibility of what she was seeing. She needed confirmation. She needed someone to tell her she was not imagining this. She picked up her phone and called Dr. Marcus Freeman, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins, who specialized in muscle development disorders. When he answered, she did not waste time with greetings. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "I need you to look at something, and I need you to tell me if I'm losing my mind." 2 days later, Dr. Marcus Freeman stood in Dr. Hayes' office at Vanderbilt, staring at the photograph displayed on her large monitor. He had flown in from Baltimore that morning. Skeptical but curious, Patricia Hayes did not make careless claims. If she believed she had discovered something impossible, it deserved careful investigation. The image filled the screen. Three Sisters, Alabama, 1898. Patricia zoomed in on the youngest sister, isolating her upper body, her arms, and her shoulders. The evidence was there, undeniable, even within the limits of 19th century photography. Marcus leaned closer, adjusting his glasses, his trained eyes studying every detail. Myostatin-related muscle hypertrophy, a genetic condition caused by mutations in the MSTN gene that controls muscle growth. In normal human development, myostatin acts like a brake on muscle tissue, preventing excessive growth. When that gene mutates, the brake fails. Muscle develops with extraordinary density and size, creating a body that appears almost sculpted even without exercise or training. The condition is extremely rare. Since it was identified in 1997, fewer than 100 cases have been recorded worldwide. Most are discovered in infancy when parents notice their baby is unusually muscular. These children grow into adults with nearly twice the muscle mass of typical individuals, remarkable strength, and a surprising resistance to physical exhaustion. Marcus studied the younger sister's deltoid muscles, visible even through the fabric of her dress. Her forearms showed muscle lines that would normally require years of intense physical labor in anyone without the condition. But this was not just labor. This was genetic structure written into her DNA, expressed in every muscle fiber. The shoulder width, Marcus said quietly, pointing to the screen. The neck thickness, the visible muscle, density in the forearms. Patricia, this matches every clinical marker we use for diagnosis today. Patricia nodded slowly, her expression serious. I know, but this is 1898. Marcus continued, voicing the same impossible thought that had been forming in both their minds. We didn't identify this condition for another 99 years. There's no way anyone looking at this girl would have understood what they were seeing. Which means, Patricia said quietly, she lived her entire life with no one understanding what she was. No medical explanation, no scientific framework. Marcus sat down heavily in the chair across from Patricia's desk. We need to find out who she was. We need to know what her life was like. The back of the photograph provided their first clue. When Patricia had originally catalogued the image, she had photographed both sides. On the reverse, in careful handwriting faded to brown with age, someone had written Ruby, Esther, and Grace, Montgomery County, summer 1898. 3 names, no surname, no exact location beyond the county, but it was a beginning. Patricia started with the 1900 United States Census, the closest complete record to the photograph's date. Montgomery County, Alabama, had a black population of nearly 30,000 in 1900. Most worked as sharecroppers, domestic servants, or manual laborers. Finding 3 sisters with these specific names within such a large population would require patience and careful searching. She spent 2 weeks studying digital census records, cross-referencing households that listed 3 daughters in the right age range. The work was slow, tiring for the eyes, and full of false leads. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in late March, she found them. A household led by Caroline, age 42, occupation listed as laundress. 3 daughters, Ruby, age 20, Esther, age 19, Grace, age 18. No father listed. No other family members in the home. An address in the rural outskirts of Montgomery County, near a crossroads settlement called Pine Level. Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she copied the information into her research notes. Grace, the youngest sister in the photograph, age 18 in 1900, which meant she would have been 16 in 1898, exactly as Patricia had estimated. But the census revealed something else, something that made Patricia's chest tighten. Caroline's occupation. One of the hardest forms of labor available to black women in the post-Reconstruction South. Hauling water, heating it over open fires, scrubbing clothes by hand, wringing them dry with raw fingers, hanging them in the blazing Alabama sun, and then ironing them with heavy flat irons heated on wood stoves. It was work that destroyed women's bodies. Most laundresses did not live past 50, their backs damaged, their hands twisted, their spirits worn down by the endless physical strain. Patricia thought about Grace standing in that photograph with her impossible strength, in a family surviving on a laundress's income, a daughter who could lift twice what others could lift, who could work longer without tiring, who never seemed to wear out. Such a daughter would have been extremely valuable. Such a daughter might also have been pushed beyond her limits. Marcus began researching the physiological implications, while Patricia dug deeper into the historical records. They needed to understand not only what Grace's condition was, but what it might have meant for her in 1898 Alabama. Montgomery County in the late 19th century was a place of strict hierarchies and harsh realities. Black families lived under the heavy weight of Jim Crow laws, sharecropping systems that often felt like economic slavery, and the constant threat of violence. For black women, life was even more restricted. They worked as domestic server, nates, laundresses, and field laborers, jobs that paid very little and demanded everything. Patricia discovered records showing that Caroline, the girl's mother, had been born into slavery in 1858. She was 9 years old when emancipation arrived. After the Civil War, she worked as a domestic servant in Montgomery before moving to the rural outskirts, where she could take in laundry from white families while raising her daughters alone. The records listed no husband, no father for any of the girls. The work of a laundress was devastating. Patricia found records showing that many women in that occupation developed severe back injuries, chronic arthritis, and permanent damage to their hands and shoulders. Hours of lifting water buckets, scrubbing fabric, and handling heavy irons placed constant strain on the body. And somewhere in that difficult life, there was Grace, a teenage girl with muscles science would not understand for nearly another century. A girl whose body carried a rare genetic mystery long before doctors even knew it existed. Medical reports from that period describing the physical damage, long-term back pain, arthritis in the fingers and wrists, breathing problems from inhaling smoke and steam, and burns caused by handling hot irons. Most laundresses worked by themselves, but some brought their daughters into the work, once the girls were old enough to carry water and wring out heavy cloth, soaked with water. Marcus described what Grace's condition would likely have meant for her body. Myostatin deficiency does not only create larger muscles, it also changes metabolism, bone density, and physical stamina in deep ways. People who have the condition usually have extremely low body fat, strong bones that resist breaking, and cardiovascular systems able to handle intense activity for long periods without tiring. For Grace, living in rural Alabama in 1898, the Sirs B traits would have been both a gift and a burden. A gift because they allowed her to do work that might help her family stay alive. A burden because they made her clearly different in a society that often punished anyone who stood out. Think about what this means. Marcus said during one of their research calls that Grace could have done the work of 2 or even 3 people. She could have carried water, lifted heavy loads, and worked hours that would have exhausted nearly anyone else, and in a household struggling to survive. On a laundress's small income, that kind of ability would have been impossible to overlook. Patricia understood exactly what he meant. Grace's strength had not really been a blessing. It had become an expectation. Patricia's breakthrough came from an unexpected place. The diary of a plantation owner's daughter, preserved in the Montgomery County Historical Society. The diary, covering the years from 1899 to 1902, included scattered notes about local black families, including several mentions of Caroline the laundress and her daughters. The first entry was short, dated February 1900. Mother sent me to the laundry cottage to collect father's shirts. The youngest girl was there, Grace. I believe she was drawing water from the well with such ease that I could hardly believe it. 2 full buckets that would have strained our strongest field hand, yet she'd walked as though they weighed almost nothing. Patricia photographed the page with trembling hands. This was physical evidence, contemporary documentation of Grace's unusual strength, witnessed and written down by someone who had actually seen her. But another entry dated July 1901 made Patricia's throat tighten. Grace delivered the washing today, carrying a basket so heavy that Thomas, our manservant, struggled to lift it from the wagon, yet she had carried it herself from the cottage Nearly a mile away, I asked how she managed such weight. She only smiled and said she had always been strong. Mother remarked later that there is something unnatural about the girl's strength. I confess I find it unsettling. The word unnatural stood out on the yellowed paper. In 1901, in rural Alabama, a black girl with remarkable physical strength would have been viewed with suspicion and maybe even fear. There was no framework for understanding what Grace was, no medical explanation that could make sense to the people around her. Patricia discovered more mentions in local records. A ledger from a Montgomery County cotton gin showed that in 1902, a worker named Grace had been hired during harvest season. Next to her name, someone had written exceptional output, equal to 2 field hands, retained for extended season. Marcus reviewed the documents with growing concern. They were using her, he said quietly. They saw what she could do, and they took every bit of labor they could get from her. Patricia nodded slowly. The pattern was obvious. Grace's strength had been noticed, talked about, and exploited, but never truly understood, never supported, never valued as anything more than a capacity for labor that could be drained dry. The more information Patricia and Marcus uncovered, the clearer the story became. Grace's strength made her useful, but it also made her isolated. In a world where black women were already pushed to the margins, being physically different created another layer of distance. Patricia located a hospital admission record from 1904 at a charity clinic in Montgomery. The handwriting was difficult to read. The paper was stained with watermarks, but the meaning was clear. Patient Grace, age 22, admitted for treatment of severe cuts to both hands sustained while operating laundry equipment. Patient reports working extended hours to support family. Physical examination reveals extraordinary muscle development in arms, shoulders, and back. Musculature appears almost masculate, and density and definition. No signs of illness. Etiology unknown. Marcus studied a photograph of the hospital record. The doctor had no framework to understand what he was seeing, he explained. He noticed that the muscles were unusual, but he could not explain the cause. This was 1904. Genetics barely existed as a scientific field. The idea that genetic mutations could affect muscle growth would not be properly described for another 90 years. But what struck Patricia most was the injury itself. Grace's hands had been deeply cut while operating laundry equipment, not because she had been careless, but probably because she applied strength far beyond what the machines were built to handle. Her power had damaged the equipment, and the equipment had injured her in return. Patricia located additional records in county archives. In 1906, Grace appeared as a worker at a lumber mill outside Montgomery. The note in the employment ledger read Grace exceptional strength, capable of handling logs that require 2 men paid standard wage, capable of doing the work of 2 men, Marcus observed, but paid the wage of a single woman, and in Alabama in 1906 that woman's wage would have been only a fraction of what a man earned. I discovered that Grace had married in 1908. The marriage certificate listed her husband as Samuel, a sharecropper. But the 1910 census showed something that made Patricia pause. The household listed Grace and Samuel but no children. The notation under children born was 0. The note under children living was also 0. Marcus recognized the possible meaning immediately. Myostatin deficiency can sometimes affect fertility. Not in every case, but in some documented examples, yes. If Grace had been unable to have children, that would have been yet another way she stood apart from others, another way she did not fit the expected role for a woman in that time and place. After 1910, the documentary trail suddenly went cold. Patricia searched census records, death certificates, property records, church registries, but found nothing. Grace seemed to vanish from the historical record completely. This was not unusual for black women in rural Alabama, especially those who did not own property, had no children, and left behind nothing that institutions considered worth saving. But for Patricia, the absence felt deeply personal. She had spent 6 months following Grace's life through fragments of evidence. The thought of losing her story to historical silence felt unbearable. She widened her search, posting questions on genealogical forums and contacting local historical societies across Alabama. She reached out to descendants of families who had lived in Montgomery County during that era, asking if anyone remembered stories about a woman named Grace who possessed unusual strength. For weeks, there was nothing. Then in late September 2023, Patricia received an email from a woman named Lorraine Mitchell, a retired schoolteacher living in Birmingham. The subject line read, "I think my grandmother knew Grace." Patricia's hands trembled as she opened the message. Lorraine explained that her grandmother Beatrice had grown up in Pine Level in the early 1900s. Beatrice had died in 1989 at the age of 94, but she had often shared stories about her childhood, including memories of a woman who lived near her family. "My grandmother used to talk about a woman named Grace who could do things no one else could do," Lorraine wrote. She said Grace could lift a wagon wheel by herself, that she worked in the fields beside men, and never seemed to grow tired. But grandmother also said Grace was lonely. People were afraid of her strength or jealous of it, maybe both. Grandmother said Grace was kind but quiet and kept mostly to herself. She died young, grandmother believed, maybe in her early 40s, simply worn out despite all that strength. Patricia read the message 3 times, her vision filling with tears. Worn out despite all that strength. It was a painfully perfect summary of Grace's life. She contacted Lorraine immediately, and during the following weeks they worked together to piece together what Beatrice had remembered. Grace had continued working through the 1910s and 1920s, always doing heavy labor, always pushing her body beyond what seemed humanly possible. She remained married to Samuel until his death in 1928. After that, the memories became less clear. As Patricia and Marcus assembled Grace's story, another pattern slowly appeared, one that reshaped the way they saw her entire life. Grace's strength had not only supported her, it had protected her entire family. Patricia traced the lives of Grace's mother and sisters through census records, city directories, and church archives. Caroline, the mother, lived to the age of 68, remarkably old for a laundress during that era. Most women in her profession died by 50, their bodies worn down by relentless labor, but Caroline survived, and the records hinted at why. By 1905, Caroline was no longer listed as a laundress. Her occupation had changed to keeping house, which usually meant she had retired or nearly retired. Patricia located property records showing that Caroline owned the small house where she lived, something extremely unusual for a black woman in rural Alabama at that time. Someone had helped her purchase that home. Someone had provided the financial support that allowed her to stop destroying her body with laundry work. Grace's sisters had both married by 1905. Ruby married a carpenter and had 5 children. Esther married a teacher and had 4 children. Both families appeared regularly in census records through the 1920s, and later, building households and raising families. Children building futures. Patricia showed Marcus the pattern. "Look carefully at the timeline," she said. Caroline stops working as a laundress in 1905. The sisters marry at nearly the same time. Both create stable homes and steady lives. And Grace is listed as a mill worker in 1906, a field laborer in 1908, and a lumber worker in 1912. She never stops working. Marcus understood right away. Grace was supporting all of them, her earnings, her effort. She was the base that allowed her mother to rest and her sisters to marry men who were not wealthy. Patricia discovered more proof. Tax records from Montgomery County showed small but steady payments on Caroline's property through 1920. The payments came from an account listed under Grace's name. She had been paying her mother's taxes, protecting the home that gave Caroline safety in her later years. She carried them, Patricia said quietly, looking again at the photograph. 3 sisters standing together in 1898. Ruby and Esther standing tall because Grace, the youngest, had supported them through her whole life. She carried them, and they survived because of her. Dr. Hayes and Dr. Hayes and Dr. Hayes. Freeman published their findings in the Journal of Medical Genetics in late 2023. The paper, titled Historical Evidence of Myostatin-Related Muscle Hypertrophy in a Photograph from 1898, presented the photograph, the historical investigation, and the medical analysis that supported their conclusion. The paper quickly made international headlines. Medical researchers were fascinated by the idea of identifying genetic conditions in historical photographs. Historians were interested in the window it opened into the lives of black women in the post-Reconstruction South. Geneticists wanted to know if there were living descendants who might carry the same mutation. But for Patricia, the meaning went deeper than academic recognition. Grace's photograph had been sitting quietly in an archive for 125 years, overlooked and ordinary. Now people around the world were seeing her, truly seeing her, and understanding that her life had been extraordinary. Grace had lived in a time and place that gave her no recognition, no support, and no understanding of what her body was capable of or what it required. She had been strong in a world that punished strength in black women, a world that used their labor and offered little in return. She had carried burdens that might have broken others, and she had done it in silence because that was what survival demanded. Marcus noticed something else in their continued research. Historical records show that Grace had helped her family survive. Her mother, Caroline, lived to age 68, extremely old for a laundress in that era. Her sisters both married and had children, creating families that continued for generations. Grace's strength had bought them time, stability, and survival. She was the reason they made it, Marcus said simply. Without her, that family would not have survived the turn of the century. She was their foundation. Patricia thought again about that photograph. 3 sisters standing in front of a White House in Alabama in 1898. Ruby and Esther standing tall because Grace had carried them through life. The discovery changed how Patricia understood the photograph. It was not just 3 sisters posing for a portrait. It was a record of sacrifice, of extraordinary strength, used not for personal gain, but for family survival. It was a tribute to a young woman who carried the weight of an entire family on shoulders that seemed genetically built to bear impossible loads. And it was proof that Samoti May's the most remarkable stories hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to notice them. The photograph of Ruby, Esther, and Grace now rests in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, displayed as part of an exhibition about black family life in the post-Reconstruction South. But its label tells a different story than most archival photographs. It explains myostatin deficiency, describes Grace's likely experience, and honors her as one of the earliest documented examples of a genetic condition that science would not identify for another century. Lorraine, the school teacher, whose grandmother had known Grace, visited the exhibition in early 2024. She stood in front of the photograph for almost an hour, studying the face of the youngest sister. Later, she told Patricia that seeing Grace honored in this way felt like closing a circle. My grandmother always said Grace never complained and never talked about how difficult her life was, Lorraine said. She simply worked, helped others, and kept moving forward. I am glad people finally understand what that meant. I am glad she is not invisible anymore. Patricia returned to that photograph many times in the months after the publication. Each time she noticed something new. The way Grace's hand rested protectively near her sister's shoulder, the slight tilt of her head that suggested both strength and kindness, the eyes that looked straight at the camera with an expression that could be seen as defiance or simply presence. Grace had lived 30-something years in a world that had no language for what she was, no way to understand her body, and no way to honor her strength except to use it. She had survived by working harder than anyone believed possible, and she had paid the cost with her health, her relationships, and finally her life. But she had also left something behind. Not children, not land, not written words, but a photograph. One image, captured in a quiet moment in the summer of 1898, that would eventually tell the world who she was. Dr. Hayes often thinks about the odds. What were the chances that this one photograph would survive, that it would end up in an archive Patricia happened to be digitizing, that Patricia would zoom in at exactly the right moment and see what no one else had noticed? Maybe it was not chance, Marcus suggested once. Maybe Grace wanted to be seen. Maybe that is why they paid for that photograph even though it cost money they could hardly spare, because on some level they knew the moment mattered. Patricia does not know if she believes that, but she knows one thing. Grace stood in front of that camera in 1898 in rural Alabama, in the heart of Jim Crow America, and allowed herself to be captured exactly as she was, strong, different, and unbreakable. And 125 years later, the world finally looked closely enough to see